Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and we're so pleased to have you at today's session of our summer series on the dynamics of change. We were just talking in our little 10-minute pre-meeting about this session being sort of ripped from the headlines kind of thing. So I think we very often touch on connections to contemporary issues, in really the vast majority of our sessions. But this one is kind of pressing in the news and in people's lives in a different way. So we're so pleased that our alum and JTS fellow, Dr. Michal Raucher, has joined us to share her expertise on the topic of evolving Jewish attitudes towards abortion today. I want to welcome anyone who might be joining us for the first time today, and feel free to check out previous sessions in the series at the link that was in the email, that was in the email that you received this morning. We're so grateful and pleased that Yael Asbel, JTS trustee, is generously sponsoring today's session at the Tzaddik level, and I know that Yael is very keen to inspire other regular learners in our series to sponsor. So if you are feeling so inspired, we hope you'll consider sponsoring a session with our amazing JTS scholars. We have 3 sponsorship levels at $540, $1,000, and $1,800, and we will be so grateful. For Q&A today, Dr. Raucher will pause a few times for questions during the session, and we'll also have Q&A at the end. As usual, you can send your questions to me via the chat, to Rabbi Julia Andelman, and since I often get many questions, I will just ask that you phrase your questions both clearly in actual sentences and also concisely. If you have technical or logistical questions, you can send those to via the chat to Ellie Gettinger or Lynn Feynman. You should have received the sources in that same email earlier today, and we will also screen share them. On that note, let's turn to our session. Dr. Michal Raucher is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University and a JTS Fellow, which means not only that she is a stellar alum of whom we're so proud, but that also she's part of our cadre of scholar teachers who expand what we're able to offer in our community learning opportunities. Her research lies at the intersection of the anthropology of women in Judaism, reproductive ethics, and religious authority. She's currently writing her second book, tentatively titled The New Rabbis, about the ordination of Orthodox Jewish women in America and the redefinition of rabbinic identity. And we'll probably hear about her first book in the session, but you can read her fuller bio at the beginning of the source packet. And she's also currently conducting interviews with Jewish women in America who have had abortions. Dr. Raucher, thank you so much for joining us today and teaching us.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for that introduction, Rabbi Andelman. It's wonderful to be with all of you. And I hope everybody's having a great summer and not getting too hot. I am thrilled to be sharing this lesson, these ideas with you today. I think a lot about change and evolution, and as Rabbi Andelman said, I do a lot of work on abortion and reproduction. So evolving Jewish attitudes of abortion fits right in, at the intersection of a few of my areas of interest. I think I want to introduce the session by kind of saying a few, one thing that might be very obvious to some of us, but is not usually part of the way we talk about religion and abortion. And that is that there has been a shift in Jewish views on abortion, even just in the last 40 years. There has been a shift. In other words, every time we try to get at the Jewish view on abortion, This is a misnomer, not only because, as we know, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? We have a multitude of Jewish identities and therefore Jewish opinions about any topic, but also because even within singular Jewish groups, there has been a shift in how we have thought about abortion, talked about abortion, understood things medically about abortion, and all of those changes have affected Jewish attitudes about abortion. So there is no one Jewish view on abortion. And in fact, even within this one kind of narrow lens that we're going to look at today, there has been a shift. That shift has followed a trajectory of what I call from justification to justice. The justification, and I will, as you'll see in the session, we'll go through these different approaches, but I'm going to offer kind of small definitions now. The justification approach to abortion is so popular in our public discourse that we don't always notice the implications of the way we talk about abortion. So when we talk about abortion bans that allow for certain exceptions, when we talk about certain reasons under which people think abortion would be permissible, we are promoting a justification approach to abortion. This approach presumes that abortion is wrong, except in certain circumstances. In other words, it is wrong to begin with, but it could be permissible if there is enough justification for crossing this boundary, for doing something that we think is wrong. Our polling mostly supports what we call, those of us who do research on abortion, prim reasons for abortion. So PRIM, that's prenatal health, rape, incest, and maternal health. Those are widely understood to be sufficient justifications. I'm putting that in kind of, quotes, justifications for abortion. Things, if those circumstances are met, if there's a problem with the fetal health, if the pregnancy is a result of rape or incest, or if there's a threat to maternal health, we generally see those reasons as justifications to perform the abortion. So that's the justification approach. This is the approach that we see in the early 1980s and even somewhat before in Jewish views on abortion. However, there has been a shift, as we'll see in this session, to a more justice-oriented approach to abortion. A justice-oriented approach to abortion starts with people's experiences of abortion. That's what it means to start from a justice approach here. So it means to take people's experiences of abortion seriously and to consider how they might affect the way we think about abortion. So it means listening to people's stories and understanding the reasons why people are having abortions. And what we know from the research about people who are having abortions is that the vast majority of abortions are not performed for those prim reasons, for prenatal health, rape, incest, or maternal health. The vast majority of abortions are performed because people can't afford another child, because it's not the right time in their life for a child, because they were not intending to get pregnant. They were using contraception at the time. Maybe their relationship status changed. There are a lot of other reasons that are generally not quote unquote justified reasons for abortion. And so as a result, once we kind of started learning that and shifting our approach to a justice-oriented approach, our Jewish opinions on abortion also started shifting as a result too. So we're going to see how that change happened. We're going to get a kind of more granular understanding of the justification approach, and then we're going to see how the justice approach offers us something different. Now, for the justification approach, what I've taken here is some sections of sources from the conservative movement's law committee, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. This is a group of rabbis and some lay people who take up Jewish legal issues and provide answers to those issues. The sources we're going to look at for the justification approach are all from the 1980s. In 1983, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, the CJLS, published 4 opinions on abortion. One was written by Rabbi Gordis, another by Rabbi Feldman, a third Rabbi Abelson, and a fourth by Rabbi Klein, which was actually published in an earlier version in 1959. In 1983, there were no women on the law committee. It was all men. This was actually the same law committee that decided to ordain women. This is a committee made up entirely of men that was making this decision about the halachic, the Jewish legal permissibility of abortion. So we're going to read their perspectives. These are just, I said we're going to take a kind of narrow approach here just to see, for example, right, to look at a small case study. There are a lot of other Jewish opinions on abortion, many of which, surprisingly or not, say similar things about abortion, some through today, others not so much. Others have shifted over time, as we'll see. But I won't have time to get into all of those other approaches, whether from the Reform movement, the Orthodox movement, or even in Israel, there was different, dynamics going on. I won't have time to go into those in the sources, but I'm happy to talk about them in the Q&A if people are interested. Okay, so let's start looking at those first sources from the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. You have in your source packet a longer sample of each of these sources. Each of these tshuvot, these responsa, are many pages long, and I don't include all of those in the source sheet. You are welcome to go look them up. They are publicly available on the committee, on the CJLS website. Maybe Ellie or Lynn can link that website in the chat. So anybody can look up the whole source. There's also an article that I wrote related, which maybe can be linked as well, that has more about each of these sources. But for now, we'll look at just pieces, and I'll kind of fill in some of the missing details here. Okay, so the first source is Isaac Klein's A Tshuva on Abortion. As I mentioned, it was originally published in 1959 and then adopted as a majority opinion on August 23rd, 1983. Klein says, "This is the attitude the rabbis have taken. Abortion is forbidden. Though it is not considered murder, it does mean the destruction of potential life. If, however, the purpose is therapeutic, this objection is removed." So he introduces for us the idea that I said earlier, right? Abortion is forbidden. It's not considered murder, but as the destruction of potential life, Klein says it is forbidden. However, right, if there are the right justifications, if there are justifications which he says are therapeutic, then the objection is removed. So Klein introduces for the committee, really, and for all of us, this idea of there being therapeutic abortions and non-therapeutic abortions. I say Klein introduced it, but actually Klein did not introduce it. This is an idea that had become popular among anti-abortion activists in distinguishing, again, between abortions that are justified, meaning those that are determined to be therapeutic, and those that are not. The distinction between these types of abortions is not medical, right? We hear the word therapeutic and we think that some abortions are medical therapy for something, and actually that distinction doesn't exist among medical professionals. So this was really a term that was meant to say certain abortions are acceptable and others are not. So what are the therapeutic abortions that Klein thinks are sufficient, are justified justified in overriding this general prohibition on abortion? He provides a few examples. He says, "I've chosen a number of responsa dealing with this question," and he gives us 2 examples, one from a rabbi in the 17th century and another from a rabbi in the 19th, 20th century, who one deals with a question of whether somebody who committed adultery could have an abortion. in order to get rid of the shame of this adulterous relationship. And the second, who says that a woman was spitting blood during her pregnancy. In other words, she was sick. She was very sick. They don't say exactly why. And in both cases, these rabbis permit abortions, not because they are therapeutic, but rather because they are performed early enough in the pregnancy. Both of these rabbis distinguish between pregnancies in the first 3 months or so and those afterwards. And yet, even though these rabbis are not actually considering the reasons why these women are having abortions, Klein concludes abortion must be that abortion is morally wrong. It should be permitted only for therapeutic reasons. But as you'll notice, he doesn't actually outline what those therapeutic reasons are. So for that, we'll turn to the other sources. But I just want to pause and notice that we have 2 examples that he gives in this tshuva of rabbis permitting abortions, one in the 17th century and one in the 19th century, meaning abortion has a long history, right? Abortion isn't a new thing. In another source, Maimonides talks about abortions for either performed by drugs or surgically. So there were many methods to perform abortions. People have known about how to stop pregnancies for a very long time. So anybody who tells you, abortion is a new phenomenon is forgetting about these sources. So when it comes to the therapeutic reasons for abortions that are given in these other sources, sorry, I'll pause for one more second. I just want to note one more thing about Klein's tshuva here is that he picks up on this idea of potential life, and the idea being that the fetus is not a full human life. This is a principle that all of these rabbis get from one basic biblical source. The story in the book of Exodus of 2 men fighting. It's Exodus chapter 21. 2 men are fighting. And in the course of their fight, they bump into a pregnant woman. As a result of this bump, she miscarries. And the punishment for the person who bumps into her, if the miscarriage is the only, quote unquote, only damage that occurs, is a fine paid to the woman's husband. So the fetus is treated like a piece of property, like other things that might be damaged, in somebody's home or around somebody's home. A fine is incurred as a punishment. However, the text says, if other damage ensues, then a punishment is life for life. And the rabbis over the centuries have understood this to mean other damage, meaning if the woman dies, then the punishment is life for life. And from this source, from reading the difference in punishment, if the loss is just fetal loss, rather, as opposed to if the loss is the woman's life, as they notice the difference in punishment, the rabbis conclude over the centuries that therefore fetal life is not equivalent. It's not as valuable as a woman's life. So this is how Klein and many others get to the idea that the fetus is potential life, but it's not full life. Okay, so let's go on to another justification source that we get, this one from Rabbi Robert Gordis. So he says the rabbinic discussions on the subject are primarily concerned with therapeutic abortions. There are several types of abortion that may be described as extensions of the therapeutic category into the mental area. And then he goes on, earlier Jewish authorities devote little attention to the problem of women who become pregnant as a result of incest or rape, yet undoubtedly both of these evils existed in the past. Whatever the reason, it will be generally agreed that the victims of such atrocities have already undergone major psychological trauma, even if they did not suffer additional physical violence. Gordis very sympathetically goes on to say that, that if one were to force a woman to continue a pregnancy that were the result of rape or incest, it would be bringing into the world a permanent reminder of the terror and the shame that she experienced at the time the crime was committed. and the child would forever bind her to the one who had viciously violated the sanctity of her person. So he says very clearly, right, that in the case of rape or incest, abortion should certainly be permissible. And he notes that earlier sources didn't think about that issue, not because they didn't happen, but perhaps because we weren't talking about them as much, we weren't aware of them as much. But surely those rape and incest happened in the past. And now we are aware, and we're aware of the trauma that continuing a pregnancy in those circumstances might incur. So he says, certainly rape and incest should be included in the therapeutic category, that these are abortions that are quote unquote justified. He then continues with another justification. He says, there is warrant in rabbinic responsa for permitting abortion if the mother is deeply concerned about the health of her unborn child. If, therefore, there is a possibility that the child may be born defective because the mother is a drug addict or has taken some medication with after effects dangerous to the offspring, the pregnant woman's worry is sufficient ground for an abortion because of the debilitating effects psychologically or otherwise on her well-being. So here Gordis actually combines a few things, right, that we see. He starts with the permissibility of abortion when there is a concern about fetal health, right? Again, this is one of those prim reasons. So we have prenatal health in this first sentence from Gordis's tshuva. We had rape and incest in the previous source. So he says, if there's a concern about fetal health, and he doesn't even get very specific there. It's not even a concern that is, a diagnosis that the fetus will be incompatible with life. He doesn't qualify the health of the fetus. He just says, if there is a concern about the health of the fetus, this is a good reason. This would make abortion permissible. He even adds, right, he doesn't distinguish between how the the concern about the fetal health came about, right? If the mother took certain drugs in order to, or some medication, right? We know that there is a history of some medications being prescribed to pregnant women that then resulted in fetal deformities. So no matter the reason, if there is a concern about fetal health, he says, then for sure, abortion is permissible. And he adds at the end, the pregnant woman's worry is sufficient ground for an abortion because of the debilitating effects psychologically or otherwise on her well-being. And he says, under any of these circumstances, nobody would oppose abortions designed to prevent a major traumatic episode from being converted into a lifetime tragedy. He's thinking, right, in a variety of ways, and he does so elsewhere in pieces I'll pull out. He's thinking about how preventing an abortion in these cases might lead to further trauma. He's thinking not just about pregnancy, but about the fact that pregnancy results in birth often, which is the start of a whole life. And he's thinking about what kind of life that child might have and the parents might have as well. So, but he's still limiting, right? He says, these are the reasons, these are the justifications for when abortion would be permissible. So here he's allowed rape and incest, he allows fetal health, and he allows some kind of maternal mental health maybe in here too. Okay. The next source is from Cass Abelson, Rabbi Cass Abelson. And Rabbi Abelson also repeats what his previous, what the previous rabbi said about prenatal health, about rape, incest, maternal health. He says, and then he kind of, I want to read what he says very, very kind of clearly and slowly, because it really captures this justification approach to abortion. So he says, there is clear precedent in the tradition, as it has developed to our day, to permit abortion of a fetus to save a mother's life, to safeguard her health, or even for a, quote, very thin reason, such as to spare her physical pain or mental anguish, right? He's referencing Gordis's conclusion in the previous slide. Some recent authorities also consider the well-being of other children, and the future of the fetus itself as reasons to permit abortion. All agree that there must be a reason to justify the destruction of the potential person the fetus will become after birth, right? So he even uses that word justify to show us, right, that abortion, go back to what Klein said on that first slide, right? Abortion is morally wrong. It should be permitted only in certain circumstances, right? This is the justification approach. There needs to be a reason to justify the destruction of the potential person the fetus will become after birth. So the rabbis in those sources that we've read so far outline for us what are those reasons that they consider justifiable reasons. And so what we saw is they permit abortion for prenatal health, for rape, incest, and maternal health, which in some cases they might interpret broadly for mental anguish or mental health. Okay. Then there's this kind of, you might be asking yourself, right, if those are the reasons under which abortion is permissible, right, those coincide to those 4 reasons I said at the beginning, those prim reasons, and yet those are not the majority of abortions that are performed, what about the majority of abortions, those quote unquote non-therapeutic abortions? Well, Rabbi Gordis takes this up. He says, while therapeutic abortions are by no means negligible in number, the gravamen of the struggle today lies in the area of non-therapeutic abortions, right? In other words, the abortions that they've determined to not be therapeutic in some way, where the woman simply does not wish to have the child born, what's so-called abortion on demand. Her motive may be the size of her family or the fact that she is unmarried or simply a desire not to be burdened by the responsibility of child raising, excuse me. So again, I'll just flag for you, right? Remember, non-therapeutic and therapeutic are not medical terms. They are terms invented by the anti-abortion movement to distinguish between abortions that are permissible and those that are not. Same with abortion on demand. This is a term that also was created by the anti-abortion movement in order to make it seem like women were kind of like deciding randomly to have abortions. There's usually a straw man of a straw pregnant woman of, a woman who decides, wakes up in the 8th or 9th month and just decides to have an abortion. This is usually what abortion on demand is trying to help us, trying to make us think about these women who are kind of callously and randomly deciding to have abortions. As when I share these kinds of sources with medical professionals, perhaps there's some on this call, sometimes they laugh and they say, we would never say knee surgery on demand or heart surgery on demand, but for whatever reason, we say abortion on demand in order to make it seem like it is some kind of callous decision. So he says, really, the problem is with these abortions that they've considered non-therapeutic, right? All of these abortions for the reasons that, they can't afford to raise another child. They're in the middle of school. Their partner isn't with them anymore. Or they weren't intending to have a child to begin with. And he calls these non-therapeutic abortions. And he says, these are really the problem that we're dealing with today. These are the abortions that are much more popular, right? So he knows that these are the more common abortions. So initially, Gordis's response, if you read in between the 2 highlighted sections on your source sheet, you'll say that he actually is sympathetic to them in some ways, right? He's sympathetic to the other children that might, already be living in a family, and now the family is burdened with another child, or the people who kind of can't get themselves out of poverty and are stuck now with another child to feed, and we don't have the social network to support these families. He does, I think, express a lot of sympathy for these families. And then he asks, do these considerations effectively dispose of the case against abortion on demand and justify the practice? In other words, are these considerations, these sensitivities, these concerns about the family or the woman or, the health of the other children, do they justify abortion for quote unquote non-therapeutic reasons? And he says, no, such a conclusion would be premature. He says the alleged right of abortion on demand is generally supported by the argument that a woman has rights over her body. This is a contention which Judaism, and indeed all high religion, must reject on both theological and ethical grounds as being essentially a pagan doctrine. It is basic Jewish teaching that no human being is master of his own body because he did not create himself. Male and female alike have been fashioned by God in his image. So there are a few things going on here, right? He's referencing the kind of feminist claims over the right to abortion. And remember, throughout the 1970s, the 60s and the 70s, right, women saying they had rights over their own body and the whole political cause associated with that, which he connects together. And he says, these are simply not Jewish ideas. In fact, he goes even further. He says they're not ideas belonging to any high religions. High religion is referenced by Gordon elsewhere in some of his other writings as reflecting both Judaism and Christianity. Right? He aligns Judaism and Christianity in his other writings as being part of high religion, by which he means non-pagan religions. There was a strong effort during this time, the early 1980s, the late 1970s, the early 1980s, to align Judaism with Christianity as part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And if you'll remember, the late 1970s is where we saw the rise of the Christian moral majority, right, which linked evangelical Protestants, Catholics, and some Mormons in their opposition to abortion. And Gordis, writing about this, is sympathetic to their moral argument. And he wants Judaism to be part of this coalition in a way, establishing morality for the country. So he goes on in the next part of his tshuva, the acceptance, because he's commenting on the fact that the laws have already been passed, right? This is post-1973, post-Roe, so abortion is federally legal. The acceptance of abortion as legitimate is, of course, far from unanimous, right? Even though we've passed these laws, he says, abortion is still not legitimate, according to many people. On the contrary, it has evoked passionate opposition from the Right to Life movement and other groups whose original impetus derived from Catholic theology, but whose ranks include people of other persuasions as well. Right here, he's referencing that Christian moral majority from the late 1970s and early 1980s. What the anti-abortion movement may lack in numbers and practical influence is largely compensated for by its zeal and dedication. So he's commenting, and I'm going to pause after this source, by the way. So if you're thinking of questions, start getting them into the chat. What he's already thinking, his reality, right, is very different from our reality today, right? He says what the anti-abortion movement may lack in numbers and practical influence, right? At the time, the Christian moral majority didn't have the political power that it has today. But he's saying that it lacked in numbers and practical influence, but it's compensated for by its zeal and dedication. He admires their zeal and dedication, their commitment to his understanding of morality. All Americans, including those who do not share its position, owe the movement a debt of gratitude for reminding the American people that moral issues cannot be settled merely by a majority in the legislature or by the decisions of judges. Gordis and many others would like the judges, and they say this in various statements that come out of the conservative movement and various other Jewish public statements at the time, they would like morality to be determined by religion, right? But they don't necessarily want religion to determine the law or the political perspectives of legislatures, right? So he says, moral issues aren't settled merely by a majority in the legislature. In other words, the majority in the legislature has determined that abortion is legal, should be legal, but he doesn't want that to be confused with the moral position. The moral position he wants to be settled by religion, as many of these Christian anti-abortion groups did as well, at least initially. The moral position should still be that abortion is forbidden except in certain circumstances, right? That's the justification approach that they're laying out in these tshuvot in the 1980s. So I'm going to pause there. I'll do a recap after the questions, just so we all know where we were, and then we'll move on to the justice sources. And I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop. I'll stop my screen. Okay. So Rabbi Andelman, what questions do we have?
Okay, I just want to acknowledge there's so much coming in the chat, and I know I speak for both of us in saying that there's a strong awareness here of how charged an issue this is for so many people. I know that you're going to get into people's stories more in as you continue, and just really many excellent questions. So we'll get to as many as we can. Can you clarify what Klein, exactly what does Klein define as the sin or the prohibition of abortion? Because I think we skipped over that a little bit.
Yeah, Klein is actually a little confusing because he says the sin of abortion is that it is the destruction of potential life, except that the sources that he gives to prove that don't support that position. So in other words, the sources that he gives to support that, those other tshuvot, allow for abortion during pregnancy. They don't have a problem with the potential life issue. So I think for him, there is a bit of a mismatch, but he says for him, the problem is the destruction of potential life.
So in terms, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say that, those of us kind of hearing that, there are a few ways that potential life could go, right? On the one hand, potential life is explicitly not life, right? That's what makes it potential life. And so they use potential life in a kind of fungible way. In other words, sometimes potential life is what actually allows for those justifications, right? Because the fetus is only potential life and not full life, therefore abortion can be permissible in these certain circumstances. But when they want to say that abortion is not permissible because of the reason, then they'll say, well, it's potential life and you can't destroy potential life. So it's a muddy category, and Klein doesn't help clarify it.
Right. And in terms of the language of halakha, of Jewish law, would we put potential life, right? There's a prohibition of spilling one's seed. Is that sort of the area of halakha that we're thinking of? It's not like, because that's not, potential life is not a phrase that we often use in halakha.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not heard it compared to, right, spilling seed, but and none of them talk about it in that way. So you are raising an interesting question that I hadn't thought of before, which is, where are they getting this phrase potential life from? Because even because that biblical source, right, just says fetus. It's just, there is no kind of qualification on what kind of life is the rabbinic discussion that follows. And there are kind of various thoughts about when the fetus becomes more valuable, right? In other words, some people think There's one rabbinic opinion that after 40 days gestation, the fetus has kind of a different kind, it falls into a different category. But those we have to question also, because how did they know when 40 days gestation was? Most people didn't even know they were pregnant until what we call quickening, until the 5th or 6th months, until they felt the fetus move inside them. So what is 40 days gestation, right? So there is some idea about that. But then there are other rabbinic sources that permit abortion until the very end of pregnancy. So does it therefore have this category of potential life throughout the pregnancy and then only afterwards it's full life? I don't know. I think, right, based on my reading of these sources, I think potential life is a category that allows them to kind of go both ways on the permissibility of abortion.
Thanks. There were obviously reactions to the Exodus source that is sort of weirdly at the root of this, weirdly because it's such a different context, as you explained to us. So I know that, I don't know if you're planning to talk about this today. I know you sort of about an approach that that doesn't start with that source. Are you planning to? Okay, all right.
Yes, we will. Yeah, the source is, there are many problems with the source. One is that it's not about an abortion at all. Which the intentionality of the termination of the pregnancy is precisely the kind of complex moral question that people are thinking about today. So that this source is really dealing with miscarriage and not with abortion is, I think, a glaring problem. And I'll propose some other sources that might be helpful. And the other sources that are helpful are those told from the perspective of people who've had abortions, right? The woman in this story in Exodus is totally absent, which isn't surprising, right, from a biblical source, but we have other sources now where women are not absent.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
A few people asked if in these tshuvot, in these responsa of the conservative movement, if the father's wishes figure into any of the conversation, whether whether his kind of mental well-being would lead him in the direction to want to terminate a pregnancy or continue a pregnancy. Is that, does that figure into their conversation at all?
That's a great question. So one of the tshuvot talks about that really a woman should be consulting with various other people when she's thinking about whether to terminate a pregnancy. One is the father, who they really only understand to be her husband, as well as perhaps a rabbi and a doctor and things like that. But they think about the father at least as part of the conversation. But most of them don't dwell on it a lot at all. Dr. David Kramer, a faculty at JTS, wrote a really interesting article several years ago, over a decade ago, about different ways of thinking about the fetus vis-a-vis the father as a gift, and what are the kind of obligations that people owe to gifts that have come to them. And that's that is a unique approach that I had not seen before, and I haven't seen since. But maybe if we can find that article, we can think about it, or I'll send it out afterwards if I can find it.
Great. I know that you have just huge amounts of resources to share with folks, and just people are raising so many issues about morality and religion and so much. So maybe I'll just offer now that we'll send a follow-up email with some of your resources, if that's right with you. Maybe just one more, I don't know if it's a question or a comment. I mean, the last source that you shared that kind of posits that high religion should reject the idea of bodily autonomy is just, that it just lands hard. One person put in the chat, that would kind of seem to dictate an attitude like, God gave me cancer, so I have no right to treat it.
Right.
It's I know that that's obviously a deeply held religious view of many Americans, many people. but there's so many ways that there's so many ways that that Judaism and the Jewish legal tradition, does support and value bodily autonomy.
Yeah. I think it's always curious when I think about that source that he starts from high religion rejects the idea that women have control over their bodies. And then it goes to all people. Nobody in Judaism has control over their bodies. I think because abortion is an issue that distinctly deals with women having control over their bodies, that idea ends up having some currency in these conversations. I think it wouldn't if it were an issue that affected everybody. So it is a kind of a surprising thing to hear from people who those examples are great, right? Like we do support medical interventions, and for all of the complicated reasons, abortion is not seen as among all of the other medical interventions. I mean, even on the kind of opposite end of the reproductive spectrum, right? Judaism does and has supported in many ways, in many different geographic circumstances and denominational circumstances, interventions to support reproduction, right? Assisted reproductive technologies are very well supported within halakha, within Jewish law, within Jewish cultural frameworks. And that also could be, we don't have control over our body. And, as a high religion, we take barrenness as a punishment, which also has a lot of biblical support. But instead, with abortion, these positions reflect the opposite view. And I think a lot of that has to do with Gordis's and others' sympathies for this moral majority that was developing at the time, and the fact that they really were able to shape a conversation wherein religion determined morality for the country. And when religion determines morality and the Christian majority has determined, and I say majority in quotes also because they weren't actually a majority demographically or politically at the time in any way, they called themselves the moral majority, right? They were saying that these beliefs are moral. So Judaism either had to align with those beliefs or be considered both immoral and not a religion, right? In order to be an American religion, it meant holding certain moral ideals. And that's what they were subscribing to. And that was the discourse at the time. And I hate apologizing in that way, but I really do think that that's a lot of what was going on in the air at the time.
Right. And the kind of the justification of, not to using that just in a general way of, you got yourself into this. I mean, someone put that in the chat. This isn't like cancer, but right, we wouldn't tell someone who smoked for 50 years and then has lung cancer, you got yourself into this. So there's clearly kind of a gender factor at play.
Yes.
Okay. There are literally about 100 other wonderful.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. But I will send them to you afterwards.
Send them to me afterwards, and people should feel free to write to me also. You can put my email address in, which, I can't promise I'll respond to everybody in a timely manner, but please feel free to write me questions. I'm happy to answer. Okay, so let's go back to the sources. Is that okay? Are we ready for that? Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so now we're going to shift to these stories, right? I said the justice approach is one that starts with stories. So I want to start with some stories, and the stories are from Jewish women who've had abortions. There had been, until last week, this is very exciting. Well, I guess 2 years ago plus last week, but there had been no real sustained research on Jewish women who've had abortions. We know very little. We know there's a lot of abortion research out there that in general has looked at the demographic characteristics of people who've had abortions in the United States, the reasons people have had abortions in the United States, and now a big focus of abortion research has been how far people are traveling in order to get abortions today. It's very far, hundreds of miles to get abortions in some cases. And there's also new research into the cost of abortions today. We really don't have any good information on that. So, but we've known for several years, based on like one set of research data about the demographics of people who've had abortions, that about 62% of women who've had abortions identify as women of faith. Of those, about 54 identify as Christians, half Catholic and half Protestant. And then another 8% or so identify as other religious traditions. Among those are Jews. But we don't know anything really about the Christians or the others. So some of the research that I've been engaged in the last 2 years is interviewing people of faith who are having abortions now in the United States. We've interviewed almost 100 women who've had abortions in the last 2 years. Most of those have been Christian because of our various recruitment methods. Just last week, I launched a new study. I interviewed a few Jewish women for that research. And just last week, I launched a new study of Jewish women who have ever had abortions in the United States. We already have over 25 participants just from the last week. So this is very exciting. And if I'm giving this talk in 6 months, I will have a lot more different exciting data to give you. For now, though, I'll share with you a few stories of Jewish women who have published their abortion stories in the press, who have shared their stories publicly. 2 are with names and one shared their story anonymously. This sharing of abortion stories publicly has been part of a broader movement of #ShoutYourAbortion, this movement that launched in the last couple of years in order to normalize abortion and normalize talking about abortion. And so people, not just Jews, have shared their abortion stories very publicly and very bravely. And I want to kind of just emphasize the bravery now for a moment, because today, admitting you've had an abortion is in some states the admission to a crime. So we are extremely grateful for the people who've shared their abortion stories publicly and those who are reaching out to us now about their abortions. So I'm going to share 3 of them. I'll reshare my screen so you can see them. And there's so much richness in these stories to pull out. The first 2, you'll notice, have been very carefully crafted as publications, right? The authors write beautifully about their experiences. And the third is this anonymous story that has a bit of a different feel. So the first comes from Rabbi Rachel Pass, who published her abortion story shortly after Texas passed their quote unquote heartbeat bill. And she felt very moved to share her story. Rabbi Rachel Pass got pregnant when she was a rabbinical student at HUC, the HUC in New York. She was she writes about being at a visiting pulpit with a high holiday pulpit for Rosh Hashanah, and she conceived. And she writes about the experience of having morning sickness in class the following week, of really trying to think about what she was going to do. She spoke with mentors and consulted sources and thought about and read blogs about why she's happy, why somebody's happy they had an abortion and why they're not happy they had an abortion. And then she writes, ultimately, I made the choice using the instinctual wisdom inside myself, heeding nobody's opinion but my own, and perhaps God's. We Jews are commanded in lines that appear in this week's Torah portion. I have put before you today blessing and curse, life and death. Uvacharta v'chaim, choose life. She continues, that commandment has been co-opted as a rallying cry for those who support restrictions on abortion, such as the Texas abortion ban on abortions after 6 weeks that went into effect this week when the US Supreme Court declined to block it. But for me and so many others, this verse is a clear rebuttal to that law, the most significant infringement on abortion rights in America since Roe v. Wade protected a woman's right to choose 48 years ago. So she interprets this law differently, right? In this whole conversation about potential life and fetal life and a woman's life, Uvacharta v'chaim, choose life. Choose life is a slogan of the anti-abortion movement. And of course, the life that they mean is fetal life, right? Choose the fetus's life. They're trying to, whereas the pro-choice movement, right, the movement that supports abortion has branded themselves as choice, right? They're saying, yeah, there is a choice here. Choose life, choose fetal life, right? So that they don't want to be anti-abortion. They're saying we're also supportive of choice. We want people to choose life, fetal life. And she offers a corrective, right? Her experience is that her life actually really mattered there. She goes on to describe the abortion, the experience of getting an abortion, of going into the Planned Parenthood downtown and taking the first of the 2 sets of abortion pills with a doctor who looked like her. There's this sense that there is this kind of Jewish familiarity there between them. She says she took the second set of pills while she was streaming Shabbat services. She whispered blessings during the abortion. When she found out she was pregnant, she whispered a blessing. When she performed the abortion, she whispered a blessing. She took her friends to the mikvah with her after the abortion to ritually mark the experience that she had had, right? The mikvah is a very commonly used a ritual bath that people use after giving birth or having a miscarriage, and she wanted to use it for the abortion as well, and invoked some rituals that others had written for an abortion. And she says, it's impossible to extricate my Judaism from my abortion. And yet you might also assume that my abortion would not have been Jewishly okay, permissible under halacha or Jewish law, because I simply did not want to be pregnant, because mine is the kind of abortion that anti-choicers most disdain. The standard Jewish line on abortion is that Judaism traditionally permits abortion when the pregnancy endangers the life of the mother. This goes back to those prim reasons. This derives from Mishnah Ohalot, which states that for a woman who is having a hard labor, maksha leiled, they cut up the fetus in her womb and remove it limb by limb. So most of our justification sources from the first section of this class were also referencing that source and read it as Judaism permits abortion only in those circumstances when a woman is in physical danger. But then she emphasizes, she sits with this last part of the Mishnah, of the rabbinic source. She says, Mipnei shechayeha kodmin lechayav, because her life comes before its life. Chayeha kodmin lechayav. Her life comes before that of the fetus. And she goes on in her essay, which you can all access online, to discuss that various rabbinic authorities over time have given examples of her life coming before the fetus's life, whether that has to do with her mental health or her shame or her honor or her desire to care for her other children, that as long as the emphasis is on her life, that also is consistent with Jewish teachings on abortion. So Rabbi Rachel Pass does this beautiful kind of alternate reading of the Jewish sources and shows us how having an abortion, even for one of those quote unquote non-justified or non-therapeutic abortions, can also be deeply Jewish and deeply meaningful. The next source is Jewish in a different way. Here, this one comes from Sarah TuttleSinger, who is currently a writer who lives in Jerusalem with several children. Sarah TuttleSinger writes about needing an abortion in college. She was a student at UC Berkeley, and she walked into health services very nervous. She was pregnant, and she wanted an abortion. And the social worker, in a very non-judgmental way, who also, by the way, she also interestingly comments on the fact that the social worker looked like her mom. In other words, there was kind of a familiarity, a Jewish familiarity going on there. Sarah TuttleSinger, part of her shame that she expresses in this piece is about the idea that quote unquote nice Jewish girls don't get knocked up second year of college. She had this idea that resonates, I think, with a lot of people, that it just isn't a nice Jewish girl thing to do, to get pregnant when you're not married, when you're too young, that nice Jewish girls are supposed to plan their pregnancies. And she thought she was a nice Jewish girl. And so for her, part of the shame is in kind of dealing with that inconsistency. So she's very nervous because the social worker says that the abortion will cost $250. And the student health insurance plan that she has will cover some of it, but she doesn't have enough money to cover the rest of it. So the social worker looks at the Jewish star necklace that was hanging around her neck and says, "Are you Jewish?" I nodded. My face flushed and I looked down at my shaking hands. I taught Hebrew school at my synagogue. I received our rabbi scholarship for outstanding work in the Jewish community. I kept kosher, and I was 19 and pregnant. Again, she's trying to kind of grapple with this. I was a nice Jewish girl and I'm pregnant, right? The social worker says, okay, that's good, because there is a philanthropic Jewish women's group that offers a scholarship of $250 to help cover costs. Would you be interested in that sort of thing? I wondered if I would have to write an essay or give them my SAT scores or show them my bat mitzvah certificate, again, to prove that I am a nice Jewish girl. How would I qualify? And the social worker says, by being pregnant and by not wanting to be pregnant and by being Jewish, she replies. So she takes a scholarship, she has the abortion, and she says what was so great about that moment was that not only had she found a way to finance her abortion, but she says, for the first time since I found out I was pregnant, I realized that I wasn't the first, nor would I be the last knocked up, nice Jewish girl. It's this great moment for her of realizing that there had been other people before her, right? Somebody established this philanthropic group, and the philanthropic group will help other women in her situation as well. And I think about how powerful for Sarah TuttleSinger, right? Whereas for Rachel Pass, what made her abortion Jewishly meaningful was the various rituals and blessings that she could call upon, the songs, the community she had around her that could help her make meaning out of this experience. What helped Sarah TuttleSinger feel accepted within Judaism, feel that her abortion could be part of her Jewish story, her Jewish identity as well, was knowing that other Jewish women had gone through the same experience, that this was really kind of meaningful for her. So that story, I think, is lovely as well. The last story that we're going to look at before we pause once again, and I can't emphasize to you enough how much I suggest you following the hyperlinks in the sources and reading the full stories. They are so touching and moving, and they are so meaningful. So if you are able to, I really encourage you to. The next source that we're going to look at again, and then we'll take a quick pause for questions, is one of the stories that journalist Avital Chizik Goldschmidt collected several years ago. In 2018, she interviewed about a dozen Orthodox Jewish women, many in America, some in Israel, and some in the UK, about their abortions. And she published just segments of their stories. They were very concerned about their privacy. And so they all shared their stories anonymously, and she only published parts of them. But their stories are really telling, because again, I think part of this, as I said, sharing your abortion is about breaking down stereotypes, right? It's about normalizing abortion. So we might think that Jews don't have abortions for the reasons that Sarah TuttleSinger and Rachel Pass had abortions. We might think that Orthodox Jewish women don't have abortions, but in fact, they do, and they do. So I'm going to share just one of them. This one is coming from a woman who lived in the US. She was 31 weeks pregnant with her second pregnancy. These abortions we talk about a lot. We talk about what we call termination for medical reason, TFMR. What we know for the research from the research is that most people who have abortions in these circumstances are either dealing with, in other words, abortions later in pregnancy. You might think after the first trimester, after the second trimester, but just later in pregnancy. It's either because they've received some new information or their circumstances have changed. This example is somebody who received some new information about a diagnosis about the fetus, and they needed to terminate the pregnancy. And they went to a doctor. They had to go to Colorado to get the abortion, all the way from New York to Colorado. He charged over $10,000 for the abortion. It was a very simple procedure. The doctor said he saw frum people before, another word for kind of religious. He told us we're not the first people with kippot, with yarmulkes. And then they performed the abortion and they went home to deliver. And she talks about how meaningful it was to have a rabbi who understood what they were going through and sympathized with them. Baruch Hashem, thank God, we had a Rav, a wonderful posek, a decisor, who was really amazing, who helped us through the entire process, helped us understand this experience through halakha. We found so much comfort in the fact that halakha had an answer, a system with which we could deal with the loss. We have gone through infertility before. I've had multiple natural miscarriages, but nothing prepared us to go out of state to an abortion clinic. The fact that we had to travel out of state and go to an abortion clinic with a doctor that we didn't trust because we had no other option, and have an abortion in a basement of a medical complex that was not our hospital without our regular support staff, was so difficult. It was undignified. She continues, when you don't have a choice, you really don't have a choice, right? In other words, this abortion was not they had to make this decision because of their health. This was a very wanted pregnancy. We're religious. I follow halakha. I ask a rabbi for permission to use birth control. We went to a rabbi for this decision and knew that this was the halachic response that was most appropriate. The challenging part for us was that the American legal system made it so difficult for us to follow halakha. If abortion becomes illegal, our religious right to have access to abortion is challenged. So of course, this is prescient, right? Because this was in 2018 that they wrote this. And now, in fact, we do have a legal system that is making religious obligations for abortion very challenging and has spurred, if you're following the news, various cases in 4 or 5 states that bring religious challenges to abortion bans. So she's very clear that the legal system could make following their obligation to have an abortion challenging. But I want to pick up on something else that she said earlier, right, which is how meaningful it was, right, to have Jewish law that was able to guide their process through this very challenging time, right? So we have those justifications in halakha, right, from the 1980s that support abortion in certain circumstances like this one. But what about for Sarah and Rabbi Pass, right? How much more support could they have felt from Judaism, from their community, from the people who hold them up, right? If there was a halachic system to support their abortions as well, right? I think she really articulates nicely the power that the Jewish legal system provides for normalizing her experience and offering her comfort. Okay, I'm going to pause there and take a couple of questions, and then we'll look at some of the ways that actually the institutional response has shifted as well.
Great. So maybe we'll keep this pause for questions a little briefer just because of the time. I wanted to read to you a comment that one person shared. They said, I'm struggling with what to do with these stories. Of course, they pull at my heart, but they are just stories. On the other hand, from time to time, the Talmud instructs us to go out in the streets and see what people are doing, ... Meaning the rabbis do lift up the idea of, right, you have to see how law is playing out in people's lives. So the person kind of acknowledged that, but also I wanted to see if you could respond to the they're just stories part.
Yeah. So it's hard to know if are we thinking they're just stories because there are just 3 of them, or they're just stories because
I think I think it's kind of what role should such stories play in how we think about this. It's not law, for example.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple of things. So number one, I think a lot of legal theory in the last decade, 2 decades, has pointed out the fact that what we think of as law is actually very much informed by certain stories that we hold dear. And just because we're not explicit about the stories that we're using to inform our legal understanding doesn't mean the stories aren't there. So what I'm suggesting, right, is that I think these stories, right, have not been heard by the people who are thinking about law, that they are thinking of other stories. And we know that they have certain understandings of women who have abortions for reasons like Sarah TuttleSinger and Rabbi Pass, right? They refer to those women as callous, as having abortion on demand, as quote unquote, simply not wanting to have a child. When actually what we're talking about is people thinking about their futures differently, right? People actually making very calculated decisions. This isn't flippant, this isn't random, right? And I think these stories help challenge those narratives that are already operating behind the scenes in the law. So that's what I think the power of these stories really hold. And when we know that these stories are not just 3, that actually there are dozens and hundreds and thousands, of stories like this over for many years, there were about 800,000 to 1 million people who had abortions every year in America. So there are many, many more stories like this. And I think the more we root ourselves in real stories and not myths about abortion, we'll have a legal approach to abortion that is more justice oriented rather than being informed by these myths that are pretty negative and judgmental.
Thank you. That was beautifully said. So, well, kind of on that vein, a few people have been pushing for you to address the just the question of the use of abortion as contraception, essentially. That people, there are ways to not be pregnant other than getting pregnant and having an abortion, and why don't we kind of lead with that, and does Jewish law or wisdom sort of push us towards that, emphasizing that view?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm glad it came up because we have a lot of misconceptions about the efficacy of contraception. We see rates of efficacy around contraception, even like the really good ones, like the hormonal birth control pill, or the one that was just approved by, to be over the counter by the FDA. Of in the 90s, like 90% efficacy rate, 93, 95, 97% efficacy rate of these pills. Usually, those efficacy rates are determined based on perfect use. So that means taking the pill at the exact same time every single day, which is not the same as typical use. The efficacy rate for typical use among people is more like in the 70s and 80s%. But even if you are using it perfectly, there's still a small percentage of people who will get pregnant while using contraception, even perfectly. And there are all sorts of things that contraindicate the efficacy of contraception, antibiotics, other medications, and missing, being a few hours late one day could be enough to make that month the month that you conceive, even while using contraception. So first, I think it's important to understand that contraception is not a cure-all. that even if we had perfect use of the most effective means of contraception, and the fact that it's 1 year, the efficacy rates of contraception, even perfect use, goes down after that. So after 5 years or 10 years, your efficacy rate of hormonal birth control pill could be down to like 85% or 90%. So that leaves a lot of room for unintended pregnancies. That's number one. So even if you had perfect use of contraception, of the perfect contraception, you would still have unintended pregnancies. And the other thing to keep in mind, and this I learn a lot from the people that we're talking to who are having abortions, is that contraception is actually really hard to access. So it's expensive if you don't have health insurance. Hormonal contraception in particular, there are lots of different kinds and they react with your body a lot of different ways. And a lot of people don't like the way one kind does, but then you have to go back to your doctor and get a prescription for another kind, and that could take a few months. And I think we have a lot of access issues to address before we suggest that contraception is the cure for abortion. And a lot of people just don't like contraception. And if we think there's nothing wrong with abortion, then there shouldn't be anything wrong with somebody saying that their preferred method of contraception is abortion. In terms of the Jewish view, so there is a lot of Jewish support for contraception of many different kinds. Usually what we talk about is women's forms of contraception are considered okay for that reason that you suggested earlier, Rabbi Andelman, about spilling seed. We don't usually permit condoms unless hormonal contraception for women is somehow contraindicated medically. So there could be a lot more promotion of contraception that we see in Jewish discourse around abortion, but I would be careful about that because of the reasons I said before. There will still be unintended pregnancies with contraceptive use. Again, it's hard to say, why don't you just use contraception? It would be like saying, just why didn't you smoke for 50 years? That's asking somebody to, the other thing I want to say is, right, there are various steps here, right? So somebody conceives, they're pregnant. Not all pregnancies lead to birth. We know this because of miscarriages, right? A pregnancy doesn't need to lead to a birth. So yes, pregnancy, we could say, is the result of faulty contraception or not using contraception or whatever it is, right? That pregnancy sometimes happens, but we don't need to say that birth happens just because pregnancy happens, right? We can say that there is a stop between pregnancy and birth. And that's what abortion is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, the responses to what you just said coming in, but our time is waning. So let me
do the last couple of sources. They're quick, and then we'll stop again, and we should have some time at the end. Okay, so I'll share again. Okay, so the last two sources that I'm just going to share are of examples of the Jewish establishment shifting as well, right? So we've seen this larger public discourse shift in Jewish women sharing their stories around abortion. And what we've seen also is some shift in the rabbinic establishment and the Jewish establishment as well. And I'll point to just two examples. So the Rabbinical Assembly is another kind of arm, the Rabbinical Assembly publishes those Committee on Jewish Law, Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, Tshuvot. And they also publish these public statements that are kind of like press releases or resolutions. And so starting in 2005, 2007, they started publishing resolutions on reproductive freedom that on the one hand supported the statements made by the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, but then went further. So an example of them going further than the limitations put forth by the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards is from this resolution in 2007. They wrote, "Therefore be it resolved that the Rabbinical Assembly urges its members to support full access for all women to the entire spectrum of reproductive health care, and to oppose all efforts by federal, state, local, or private entities or individuals to limit such access. Be it further resolved that members of the Rabbinical Assembly communicate with their governmental officials on the key issues mentioned above, urging action which would promote the reproductive freedom and well-being of women and girls. So they don't stop with, we promote the legal access to abortion for certain therapeutic reasons, right? They state that earlier in their resolution, in the whereas section. But then they go further, right? They say, actually, what we want to support is full access to the full spectrum of reproductive health care, right? They are making a political statement here where they say, we rabbis, we Rabbinical Assembly fully support abortion and contraception and birth care and maternal health care and all of these things. And they are coming out in opposition to any entities or individuals that limit that access. This is a blatant shift, right? This is a clear shift from where they were in the 1980s to where they are today. And some of that might have to do, I have like a few ideas, one of which is some of it has to do with the now decades of inclusion of women on these committees. Some of it has to do with a shift in kind of public discourse, right? More awareness of liberal attitudes among Jews towards abortion, right? We have polling that suggests between 70 and 85% of Jews support legal access to abortion in all or most cases. I think part of it, though, has to do with, if we go back to Gordis's statement from before, right? Gordis wanted to align with the moral majority. And in some of the statements that come out in the early 2000s, there is an awareness that the moral majority now does have political influence, and they want to make sure that religion stays out of the political discourse, because the religion they've identified by the early 2000s is the moral majority, and they no longer hold those positions anymore. So they're trying to distance their religious influence from their political perspectives. Okay, and the last source that I'll share is the National Council of Jewish Women, which has been advocating for reproductive health rights and justice for over a century. They were involved in some of the early Planned Parenthood clinics in New York City. They came out in the early 2000s with a group they call Rabbis for Repro. And this is rabbis, Jewish educators, and cantors who have signed a pledge to support reproductive health rights and justice. There are currently about 1,600 rabbis for repro across the United States, and they are advocating in all different ways, teaching their communities. Maybe you have one in your community, writing op-eds and lobbying their state legislatures. And one of the things that the National Council of Jewish Women has published more recently is, this is from the first page of their website, but you can see it in a lot of their different sources. The National Council of Jewish Women is committed to creating a world where all people, regardless of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, or immigration status, in other words, taking all of these unique identities, have the right to build their families and live their lives with dignity, right? This is about crafting the kind of family that you want. Our Jewish experience tells us that our reproductive freedoms are integrally bound to our religious liberty, right? In other words, they're picking up on the fact that a lot of these abortion bans have been an infringement of religious liberty for religious minorities. We are committed to advancing the goals of reproductive justice so that every person can make their own moral and faith-informed decisions about their body, health, and family. And they go on to talk about reproductive health rights and justice and the importance of Jewish values in that fight. So those are just two examples. I've seen several more developing. I think in terms of the Jewish establishment, we have more room to grow and follow the justice trend, but there are certainly examples of us already moving in that direction. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much. I want to not forget to let people know that we are having a major event on related topics to this on Monday, September 11th, our annual Siegel lecture. The topic this year is abortion. We're going to be screening a new documentary short that that follows some religious freedom, some legal cases based on religious freedom arguments, meaning, you know, my religion entitles me to abortion access, those kinds of arguments. We'll be screening the film, and Dr. Raucher and a scholar from Columbia who specializes in this area of law will be our panelists. So I want to just watch your email for that. But I think people joining us today will be interested in that program on Monday, September 11th. So it just about the RA resolution. So first, I just wanted to clarify for people that right, the first kind of the first round of rabbinical assembly sources you shared from the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards are legal responsa, whereas resolutions are, you know, are voted on. The former are, you know, authored and approved by members of that select committee, whereas resolutions are kind of the voice of the membership, and any member can author and solicit signatures for resolution. So it's a very clear statement on, you know, here's where
the membership is. Yeah,
here's where the membership is, and I'm sure that I don't know if we have resolutions from that time, but I would guess that the response of the law committee, you know, were reflecting the views of the membership at that time. Someone just, oops, sorry, I just lost it for a sec. Someone just shared the comment that the RA statement or the resolution may be founded on the concept that what is legal is not limited to what is moral in a particular religious perspective. A rabbi could counsel against some abortions within their own view of halacha while supporting law that isn't controlled by religion, which maybe is stating the obvious, but it seems to be not obvious to many people that, right, if for example, you know, someone who adheres to halacha in a particular way, I would not officiate an intermarriage. Do I think that intermarriages should be illegal? Of course not. So it's interesting how much we just skip over that step of, first of all, kind of equating categorically our understanding of religious law with morality. That's kind of one big thing. And then, you know, and then the idea of imposing one's religious views or morality on the larger population.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what ends up happening aside from the, you know, equating those two and imposing them, is that there's a reduction of diversity that then happens, right? We know that moral systems are diverse and complex, and same as religious legal systems. And yet when we try to equate, we're reducing each one to just one kind and imposing it.
And someone just asked if there have been additional resolutions of the RA since 16 years ago, and if the RA is engaged in supporting lawsuits or other kinds of action against abortion restrictions.
Great question. Yeah, there have been some more recent resolutions from the RA. Some, you know, evolution is not a clear path. Some bring us back to some of those older statements. So yeah, but there have been some more recent ones, which you can also find on the CJLS website, or the Rabbinical Assembly website. You can find those as well. There are some that are very repetitive, and some of them refer to specific laws that are going to be enacted or that are up for debate. And either right before Dobbs, like when the decision was leaked, or right afterwards, there was another statement, I think. So there have been some more. I don't know if the RA has signed on to any of those lawsuits, but there has been also some movement about creating a new tshuva, so a new legal document about Jewish law that would be created by the law committee. And I think I think RA rabbis individually are involved in some of the lawsuits, but maybe not the RA writ large.
Yeah, I don't know if the RA has ever, you know, done an amicus brief, for example. Right. It's not something that the movement organizations tend to do. but I will say, just having been at the Rabbinical Assembly Convention in this past November in St. Louis, Missouri, where there were, it was post-Dobbs, and there was some restrictive legislative activity going on the state level. We did kind of invite the press to a gathering where we shared the views of the majority of the membership supporting abortion access. Okay, it's 2:30.
Sure, there are so many.
Yeah. Okay, so
you want to do one more?
Yeah, literally okay. in like 1 minute.
I'll be quick.
People have raised the obvious issue that going back to the therapeutic reasons that you raised up front, certainly they, as you said, they apply to a minority of abortions, yet they're very, they continue to exist today and are very real reasons that people do seek out abortions. And, and part of what's happening in so many states is, politicians deciding what constitutes a legitimate therapeutic abortion versus medical professionals. I don't know if there's a way to comment briefly on that from a Jewish perspective.
Oh, from a Jew, yeah. Well, I'll say something about the laws, actually, which is that medical professionals, what we're hearing is that medical professionals find these laws terribly difficult to implement. So for people who, so doctors don't know, like the laws are not written with doctors in mind. So, I mean, they're not written by doctors, so, or by OBGYNs. So, or fetal health expert, neonatal, whatever. So so doctors often find them inapplicable. They're not sure if this particular exception applies to this particular diagnosis that they're finding, or this particular, what does it mean that a woman is about to die and therefore you have to do the abortion? I mean, that those kinds of implementing the exceptions is becoming very hard. So some of the early data we have on the rates of abortion in these states where there were bans is so we know that about 25% of abortions happen for those prim reasons. So the prenatal health, rape, incest, and maternal health. If those exceptions, right, if there was a state that had exceptions for just those four things, then you would find that the percentage of abortion in that state dropped 75%, right? You would still see that 25% of abortions being performed in that state. But instead, what we see in those states is that 0 abortions are being performed, which means the exceptions aren't working. So I think that is another thing, when we think about, just to connect to the Jewish sources, right? There might be some kind of moral or legal system in which those exceptions are the ones that are permissible, but in practice, it's not a workable system. So what is the value of this kind of thinking when we can't implement it correctly, sufficiently to save lives? So I think that's a really important question to return to.
Thank you so much for taking on this, huge, pressing, and incredibly complex topic. I think you shared a lot of new sources, new perspectives, kind of new nuances, and how to think about these issues with kind of trace the change for us with our learning audience. So thank you so much for teaching us today. I want to thank everyone for coming, and also again thank Yale Aspel for sponsoring the session. We will send out a follow-up email with some resources from Dr. Raucher, and I also just want to invite folks back for our session next week, which is called Becoming Jewish Americans, Popular Culture and Protest in Yiddish New York. We've moved into kind of the contemporary section of our series on change. This is going to be taught by by PhD candidate Annabelle Cohen, who has curated a current exhibit in the JTS library, Living Yiddish in New York, which if you're in the New York area, you should come and see. People are loving it. She'll be sharing her expertise in that area. on change, social change made by kind of that community in New York. So hope you will join us for that. In the meantime, have a wonderful another week of summer here, and thanks once again to Dr. Raucher for teaching us today.
Thanks, everybody. It's been a pleasure.